The dust cloud appeared on the horizon just after dawn, rolling across the Montana plains like a warning. Jake Morrison stood on his porch, coffee cup frozen halfway to his lips, watching the stagecoach approach his ranch. His heart hammered against his ribs. She was here. The woman from the letters. The woman who had signed her name with a flourish that made his hands shake when he first read it 3 months ago. He hadn't expected this. None of it. The ad he placed in the Eastern papers had been a moment of weakness after another long winter alone. Rancher seeking companionship. Must be hardy, honest, and unafraid of solitude. Simple words that had brought exactly 3 responses. 2 he dismissed immediately. But the third letter, written in bold, confident strokes, had made him read it 7 times before he could set it down. I am not what you expect, she had written. I am not small or delicate. I am not quiet or demure. But I am strong, and I am tired of being looked at like a curiosity. If you want someone who can work beside you, who won't break under pressure, who won't shrink from hardship, then perhaps we can come to an understanding. But know this, I take up space in this world, and I will not apologize for it. The stagecoach pulled up in a spray of gravel. The driver jumped down, looking rattled, and reached up to help his passenger. What emerged made Jake's coffee cup slip from his fingers and shatter on the wooden planks. She was enormous. Not fat, but tall and powerfully built, with shoulders that would make most men look twice. She had to duck to exit the coach, and when she straightened to her full height, she stood at least 6 inches taller than Jake's own 6 feet. Her red hair was pulled back severely, revealing a face that was striking rather than pretty, with sharp cheekbones and eyes the color of a winter storm. Those eyes found him immediately, and she didn't smile. She studied him the way a general might study a battlefield, taking in every detail with clinical precision. The silence stretched between them like a rope pulled taut. You're smaller than I imagined, she said finally, her voice deep and accented with something European he couldn't quite place. Norwegian, maybe, or Swedish. But you'll do. Jake felt heat crawl up his neck. He'd been called many things in his 32 years, but small had never been one of them. I think there's been some misunderstanding. Helga Anderson, she interrupted, stepping forward with a hand extended. Her grip, when he took it, was like shaking hands with a blacksmith. And there is no misunderstanding. You placed an advertisement. I answered. We corresponded. You sent money for passage. I am here. This is how arrangements work, yes. Yes, but, he gestured helplessly at her, at all of her, and immediately regretted it when her eyes narrowed. But what? I told you I was not small. I told you I was not delicate. Were these simply words to you? Did you think I was being modest? She took another step forward, and Jake found himself backing up against his own porch railing. I have traveled 3,000 miles on your promise of a new life. On trains that were too small, through towns where people stared and whispered and pointed. I am here now, and we have an agreement. I didn't know you'd be. He trailed off, searching for words that wouldn't offend. A giant. She supplied the word without emotion. Yes. I am aware. I have been aware my entire life. In my village, they called me Helga the Tower. Here, I imagine, they will call me worse things. But you, Jake Morrison, you will call me your wife, as we agreed, or you will give me work and a place to sleep until I can make my own way. Those are your choices. The sun was climbing higher now, casting her shadow across the porch, across him, across everything. Jake swallowed hard, looking up at this woman who had just rearranged his entire world without asking permission. Welcome to Montana, he said quietly. Let me show you the house. 3 weeks passed in a silence so thick it could choke a man. Helga moved through the ranch house like a force of nature, reorganizing everything with brutal efficiency. She cooked massive meals that Jake couldn't finish, cleaned with the intensity of someone waging war against dust, and worked the land alongside him without complaint. But she barely spoke, and when she did, her words were clipped and practical. The wedding had been a rushed affair at the town courthouse, witnessed by a bored clerk and a justice of the peace who kept stealing glances at Helga like she might suddenly produce a circus tent. She'd worn a simple blue dress that strained at the shoulders, and Jake had worn his father's old suit that smelled of mothballs and regret. They'd signed papers, shaken hands, and returned to the ranch as strangers who shared a last name. Jake slept in his bedroom. Helga took the guest room. Neither discussed the arrangement. The town of Copper Ridge had reacted exactly as Jake had feared. The first time he'd brought Helga to the general store, conversations had died mid-sentence. Mrs. Patterson had actually gasped and clutched her chest. Old Bill Henderson had laughed until his wife elbowed him silent. And Sarah Jane Cooper, the banker's daughter who'd made it clear she'd expected Jake to court her eventually, had looked at Helga with such naked contempt that Jake had felt his hands curl into fists. "Is that your new wife?" Sarah Jane had asked, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "How exotic. Where did you find her? A traveling show?" Helga had simply looked down at the smaller woman, her face expressionless. "I came from Norway, where women are not afraid to take up space." "Where are you from?" "A dollhouse." The store had erupted in shocked whispers. Jake had paid for their supplies quickly and left, his face burning. But when they'd loaded the wagon, he'd caught Helga's hands shaking as she tied down the supplies. That night, he'd found her standing in the barn, staring at nothing. "You don't have to stay," he'd said quietly. "I can give you money. Help you get settled somewhere else. Somewhere bigger, where people are more." "More what? Accepting?" She'd laughed, but it was a bitter sound. "There is nowhere like that. Not for women like me. I am too much everywhere I go. Too tall, too strong, too loud, too different. But here, at least, I have work. I have purpose. I have a roof that doesn't leak and food that doesn't run out. That is more than I had in Norway." "What did you have in Norway?" She turned to face him then, and in the dim lantern light, her face looked carved from stone. 5 brothers who grew tired of their giant sister. A father who died of shame that his daughter was larger than his sons. A village where no man would look at me except to laugh. "So yes, Jake Morrison, I will stay. I will work your land and keep your house and be your wife in name, and you will leave me in peace. That is the arrangement." "That's not what I want," he'd said, surprising himself. "What do you want?" Her voice had dropped to something dangerous. "A real wife? Someone to warm your bed? You think because you paid for my passage, because you gave me your name, that you own me now?" "No." He'd stepped closer, looking up at her even as his heart raced. "I want to know you. I want to understand why someone who writes with such fire and intelligence would agree to marry a stranger. I want to know what you dream about, what makes you laugh, what scares you. I want more than silence and separate rooms and this wall between us." She'd stared at him for a long moment, her chest rising and falling with heavy breaths. Then she'd said, in a voice barely above a whisper, "You want too much." But something had shifted that night. Small things at first. She'd started asking him questions about the ranch, about his life before she arrived. He'd told her about his parents, dead 5 years now, and how the ranch had nearly broken him in his grief. She'd listened without offering platitudes, just nodding occasionally as if cataloging information. Then one evening, while they worked together mending fence posts, she'd spoken about her childhood. About being the tallest girl in her school by age 10, taller than most men by 15. About the boys who dared each other to ask her to dance, then laughed when she accepted. About her mother, who died giving birth to her, as if even entering the world Helga had been too much. "My father used to say I killed her," Helga said, her voice flat. "Every time he looked at me, I saw her ghost in his eyes. I was his failure. His shame." Jake had stopped working, leaning on his post digger. "You're not a failure. You're the strongest person I've ever met." She'd laughed then, but it was softer. Almost real. "Strong. Yes. That is what people say when they cannot say beautiful." The storm came in late April, when the mountain snow was still melting and the creeks ran high and fast. Jake had seen the clouds building all afternoon, dark and mean, and he'd worked frantically to get the cattle down from the high pasture before the weather broke. Helga had ridden out with him without being asked, sitting astride his best mare like she'd been born in a saddle, even though she'd admitted she'd never ridden before coming to Montana. "You learn fast," he'd said, impressed by how quickly she'd taken to ranch work. "I learn what I must," she'd replied, her eyes scanning the hills for strays. "This is survival. Nothing more." But he'd started to think it was more than that. The way she'd begun to soften around the edges, smiling occasionally when she thought he wasn't looking. The way she'd started cooking his favorite meals without him mentioning them. The way she'd moved her chair closer to his at dinner, until their elbows sometimes brushed and neither pulled away. The rain hit like a wall of water, sudden and merciless. Within minutes, visibility dropped to nothing. Jake shouted for Helga to follow him toward the shelter of the tree line, but the wind tore his words away. Lightning cracked across the sky, so close he could smell the ozone, and his horse spooked. What happened next occurred in fragments. The horse rearing. Jake falling. His head striking something hard. The world tilting sideways as mud filled his mouth and rain hammered his body. consciousness flickering like a candle in wind. Then Helga was there, her face appearing above him like a vision. She was shouting something he couldn't hear over the roar of the storm. He tried to tell her to leave him, to save herself, but his body wouldn't cooperate. Everything felt distant and wrong. She didn't hesitate. She simply reached down, hauled him up like he weighed nothing, and slung him over her shoulders in a fireman's carry. Through the rain and mud and howling wind, she walked. Step after impossible step, carrying his 180 pounds like he was made of feathers. Jake faded in and out, catching glimpses of her face set in grim determination, her jaw clenched against the effort, her boots squelching through mud that tried to trap her with every stride. When he woke, he was in their house, in his bed, stripped down to his union suit with blankets piled on top of him. His head throbbed like someone was using it as an anvil. The room was dark except for a single lamp burning low on the nightstand, and Helga sat in a chair beside the bed, her head tilted back against the wall, asleep. She looked exhausted. Her hair had come loose from its braid and hung in damp tangles around her face. Her dress was still wet in places, clinging to her frame. There were scratches on her arms from branches and thorns. But she was there, keeping watch, and something in Jake's chest cracked open. He reached out, his hand shaking, and touched her knee. Her eyes snapped open immediately, alert despite her exhaustion. "You're awake," she said, leaning forward. "How do you feel?" "Like I got kicked by a mule." His voice came out rough. "You carried me. The whole way." "Someone had to." She stood, checking the compress on his head with practiced efficiency. "You hit your head on a rock. I thought maybe you would die. But you are too stubborn for that, I think." "Helga." He caught her hand, holding it despite the way she stiffened. "Thank you. You saved my life." She tried to pull away, but he held firm. "It is what anyone would do," she said, not meeting his eyes. "No. It's not. It's what you would do." He tugged her hand gently, pulling her down to sit on the edge of the bed. "You could have left me. Gone for help. But you didn't trust anyone else to save me, did you?" Her jaw worked silently for a moment. Then, in a voice so quiet he almost missed it, she said, "I could not leave you. I tried to make my feet move away, to be practical, to think clearly. But I could not. So I picked you up, and I walked, and I did not let myself think about what would happen if I dropped you or if I fell or if we both died out there in the mud. I just walked." "Why?" He searched her face in the lamplight. "Why couldn't you leave me?" She finally met his eyes, and in them he saw something that made his breath catch. Fear and vulnerability and something else, something fierce and protective and terrifying in its intensity. "Because you are mine," she said simply. "The papers say so. The law says so. And what is mine, I keep." The words should have sounded possessive, maybe even threatening. But the way she said them, with her thumb unconsciously stroking the back of his hand, they sounded like a confession. Like a promise. "And what am I to you?" he asked. "Really?" She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then she leaned down, her face close to his, her breath warm on his skin. "You are the first person who asked me what I dream about," she whispered. "That is dangerous. That is more dangerous than any storm." Jake's recovery took 2 weeks, and during that time, something fundamental shifted between them. Helga nursed him with a tenderness that surprised them both, bringing him meals in bed, reading to him from the newspapers that piled up, even laughing at his terrible jokes when the pain made him restless and irritable. And Jake, confined to bed, finally had time to simply watch her. To see how she moved through space with unconscious grace despite her size. To notice the way she hummed old Norwegian songs while she worked. To catch the rare, genuine smiles that transformed her face from striking to beautiful. The night he was finally cleared by Doc Henderson to return to regular activities, Jake found Helga in the kitchen, kneading bread dough with more force than strictly necessary. He watched her from the doorway, noting the tension in her shoulders, the way her jaw was set. "Something wrong?" he asked. She didn't look up. "Doc Henderson said you are well enough to resume all activities. That means I will return to the guest room. We will go back to the arrangement we had before." "Is that what you want?" Her hands stilled in the dough. "What I want is not relevant. We have an agreement. You have kept your part. You gave me your name, your home, your protection. I have kept mine. I work, I maintain the house, I ask for nothing more. This is fair." Jake crossed the room slowly, coming to stand on the other side of the kitchen table. "But what if I want to renegotiate our agreement?" She looked up then, her eyes wary. "What do you mean?" "I mean that for 2 weeks, You've slept in a chair beside my bed. You've cared for me in ways that go beyond any agreement we made. You've touched me with hands that are gentle despite their strength. And every time you thought I was sleeping, you watched me like you were afraid I'd disappear." He paused, his heart hammering. "I want to know if that means what I think it means." Helga's face flushed, color rising in her cheeks. "You were delirious. You imagined things. Did I imagine you holding my hand while I slept? Did I imagine you whispering in Norwegian, things you thought I couldn't understand but I heard anyway?" He'd asked Doc Henderson to translate some of the words he'd caught. "Did I imagine you calling me your heart? Your home?" She turned away abruptly, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so hard her knuckles went white. "You should not have heard those things. They were not meant for you. Who else would they be meant for? I'm your husband, Helga. Not just on paper. Not anymore. Not after what we've been through." He moved around the table, coming to stand behind her. Close, but not touching. Giving her space to run if she needed it. "I'm asking you plainly, do you want me? Do you want this marriage to be real?" The silence stretched so long he thought he'd miscalculated everything. Then she spoke, her voice rough with emotion. "You don't know what you're asking. You think you do, but you don't. I am not like the women you have known. I am not soft or yielding. I take up space. I have needs and demands and I will not shrink myself to fit into your idea of what a wife should be. If I give myself to you, it will be all of me. Every inch. Every part. And I will expect the same in return." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm counting on it." She turned then, looking down at him with eyes that blazed with something between hope and terror. "You say that now. But what about when the town whispers? When they laugh at you for having a wife who is larger than you? When Sarah Jane Cooper makes her little comments about how you must feel small in your own home? Let them talk." He reached up, cupping her face in his hands, stretching on his toes to reach. "Let them whisper and laugh and say whatever they want. You know what I learned lying in that bed for 2 weeks? That I don't care what anyone else thinks. I care what you think. I care what you feel. And I want the chance to make you happy, if you'll let me." Her breath hitched. "You cannot promise happiness. Life doesn't work that way." "No. But I can promise to try. Every day. To see you, really see you, not as too much or too big or too anything, but as exactly who you are. As Helga, who is strong and fierce and scared and brave all at once. As my wife, if you want to be." He pulled her face down to his voice dropping to a whisper. "So I'm asking, do you want to be my wife in truth? All the way? No more separate rooms? No more walls between us?" For a moment, she just stared at him, her eyes searching his face for any hint of doubt or deception. Then, slowly, she smiled. It was the first real smile he'd seen from her, wide and unguarded and devastating. "Yes," she said simply. "I want that. But Jake Morrison, you should know something first." "What's that?" Her hands came up to cover his, dwarfing them. Her smile turned wicked, dangerous, full of promise. "I warned you in my letters that I am not delicate. That I do not shrink. That I take up space. And if you give yourself to me, I will take every inch of you until you forget what it felt like to be alone. I will love you so fiercely, so completely, that you will never sit comfortably with anyone else again because they will seem empty in comparison. Do you understand what I'm saying?" His pulse thundered in his ears. "I understand." "Good." And then she kissed him, bending down to close the distance between them, and it was nothing like the chaste peck they'd exchanged at their courthouse wedding. It was claiming and surrender all at once, her mouth firm and demanding on his, her hands sliding into his hair to hold him in place while she took what she wanted. 6 months later, the ranch had never been more prosperous. The cattle were thriving, the crops were coming in strong, and Jake had hired 2 ranch hands to help manage the expansion. But more than the land's success, it was the change in Jake himself that had people talking. He moved through town with a confidence that bordered on arrogance, meeting every whisper and sideways glance with a smile that said he knew something they didn't. And he did. He knew what it was like to be loved by Helga Anderson Morrison. To be claimed by her completely. To wake up tangled in sheets with her wrapped around him like she was afraid he'd escape in the night. To sit at the dinner table and catch her watching him with eyes that promised things that made his face heat even after months of marriage. To work beside her all day and still rush through evening chores because they both knew what waited once the sun went down and the house was theirs alone. The town's attitude had slowly shifted from mockery to grudging respect. Helga had proven herself at the church social by winning every competition she entered, from pie baking to arm wrestling. She'd helped pull 3 wagons out of the mud during the spring floods when no one else could. She delivered Mrs. Patterson's baby when the doctor couldn't make it through a snowstorm, her large hands surprisingly gentle as she guided new life into the world. But it was the incident at the Copper Ridge Fall Festival that finally cemented their place in the community. Sarah Jane Cooper had been holding court near the dance floor, her voice carrying clearly as she spoke to her circle of friends. "I just don't understand it," she'd said, loud enough for half the town to hear. "How Jake can stand being dwarfed by that woman. It must be so emasculating. I heard she even carries him sometimes, like he's a child." Helga had been getting punched when the words hit her. Jake watched her stiffen, saw her hands clench, and he'd moved immediately to her side. But before he could say anything, she turned to face Sarah Jane with a smile that was all teeth. "You are right," Helga had said, her voice carrying across the now silent festival. "I do carry him sometimes. When he is tired, or hurt, or simply because I can. And yes, I am larger than him. Taller, stronger, bigger in every way. Do you know what that means, Sarah Jane Cooper?" The smaller woman had paled, but held her ground. "That he married you out of desperation?" "It means," Helga had continued, moving closer until Sarah Jane had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact, "that he is secure enough in himself to love a woman who does not make him feel bigger by being smaller. It means he values strength over fragility, partnership over possession, truth over appearance. It means he is more of a man than anyone who needs a tiny woman beside him to feel tall." She'd paused, her smile widening. "And if you must know, yes, I take every inch of him until he cannot sit right. But he wakes up every morning with a smile anyway. Can your suitors say the same?" The festival had erupted in shocked laughter and gasps. Sarah Jane had fled in tears. And Jake, instead of being mortified, had pulled Helga onto the dance floor and kissed her thoroughly in front of everyone, to hell with propriety. Now, standing on their porch as the first snow of winter began to fall, Jake watched Helga chop wood with steady, powerful swings. She'd insisted on doing it herself, claiming she enjoyed the work. He suspected she just liked showing off, and he loved her for it. When she finished, she turned to find him watching, and her face softened. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, climbing the porch steps to stand before him. "About how wrong I was," he said honestly. "When you first arrived, I thought you were too much. Too big, too bold, too everything. I thought I'd made a terrible mistake." Her expression shuttered slightly. "And now? Now I know I was an idiot. You're not too much, Helga. The world is too small for you. But somehow, impossibly, you chose to make space for me in your life. You chose to make this ranch your home. You chose me, even though you could have had anyone, gone anywhere." He reached up, pulling her down for a kiss. "I don't know what I did to deserve you, but I'm grateful for it every single day." She kissed him back, then rested her forehead against his, her hands framing his face with a gentleness that always surprised him. "You asked me what I dreamed about, remember? That first month, in the barn. I remember. I dreamed about this. About being seen. About being wanted not despite who I am, but because of it. About finding someone who could love all of me without asking me to be less." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "You gave me that. You gave me a home that is not about fitting in, but about belonging. So no, Jake Morrison, you do not deserve me. We deserve each other. And that is much better." The snow fell harder now, blanketing the ranch in white. Inside, dinner was waiting. The fire was warm. Their bed was ready. And for the first time in both their lives, they had found exactly what they'd been searching for without knowing it. Someone who saw their size, their strength, their too muchness, not as a flaw to be overcome but as a gift to be cherished. Jake took Helga's hand, his fingers barely circling her wrist, and led her inside. Behind them, their shadows stretched across the snow, 2 figures intertwined, neither dominating the other, both complete. And if the wind carried the sound of laughter from their house that night, mixing with other sounds that made the snow itself seem to blush, well, that was nobody's business but their own. The giant mail-order bride had made her boast in that first letter, and she kept every word of it. She had taken up space. She had refused to shrink. She had loved fiercely and completely. And Jake had learned that being loved by someone larger than life didn't make him smaller. It made him vast. It made him whole. It made him exactly who he was always meant to be. And every morning, when he woke up sore and satisfied and completely claimed, he couldn't sit quite right. But he smiled anyway. Because that was exactly how it was supposed to feel when you'd been loved by someone who gave you everything and asked only that you be brave enough to take it.